Hello and welcome back to part 2 of our tutorial series on using the materials that are included with DazToHue. This time we're going to be taking a look at the secondary layer for our skin material. So this is all about adding things like tattoos or makeup or scars or any other detail that sits on top of our base skin layer. So we're at the same point that we left in part 1. So we've pretty much finished with our base skin layer on our character here. So to get started, I'm going to open up the character's head material. Make some room so we can see what's going on. So we're going to scroll right down to category 10, which is this secondary layer. And I'm going to enable a secondary layer. Now, at a bare minimum, we need to give it an opacity texture. And this will define where the secondary layer is appearing on top of the base layer. So under our makeup textures folder here, I've just brought in a few examples that we can play around with. So I'm going to start with this one. Now, the opacity texture is the same as the roughness and specular textures I talked about in part 1. It needs to be a grayscale linear texture. So compression setting is grayscale, and I unticked the sRGB option to make it linear. So what I can do now is tick this use secondary layer opacity texture. And now I can drag an opacity map into it. And you can see right away we get something. We can turn on opacity adjustments and play around with things like the contrast just to make that a bit stronger. We don't want to go too far so that we're getting these harsh edges. We can bring a little bit of that back. This particular, I think it's called War Paint, doesn't have a color map, but we can use a solid color. So if we tick this secondary color, we can change the color that it's actually using. We can pick any color we want. Let's go with maybe a dark red. Something like that. It does come with a normal map, this one. They usually don't. Things like tattoos and things don't usually have normal maps. Because this is supposed to be I guess a relatively thick layer of paint on top of the skin, it does have a normal map. If we come down to secondary normal, we can use secondary normal texture. And we can assign it a normal map. Now, to see what's going on, let's bring up our buffers again. And if we have a look at the normal buffer, we can see we do have the normals for that paint layer applied to it. But specular and roughness and opacity haven't changed. Now, I don't have textures specifically for this war paint for those, but we can still tweak these buffers where that opacity texture is being applied. So, for example, let's say we want this paint to be a little wetter looking than the surrounding skin. I can come down to secondary layer roughness and enable adjustments. And I can, for example, just bring the max roughness down, and you'll see in our roughness buffer here we are now getting some changes. And also in our lit view in the middle here, we can see that we are getting a wetter look to that paint. We can do the same for specular if we enable adjustments on there. We can increase the minimum specularity so we get a really wet looking paint effect there. In our opacity buffer, which remember is our subsurface scatter weight, because this is supposed to be quite thick paint, I would expect less of that subsurface scattering to be happening where the paint is applied. So if we come down to our secondary scattering layer, and again enable adjustments, I can drop that maximum opacity down. You can see now we're getting less scattering where the paint is applied. You don't want to go crazy like that. You want some scattering to still be happening. We'll bring that back to somewhere around there. And that's about it for this particular one. I think if we come back to our lit view, you can see that's looking pretty good. Let's take a look at another one. This time we'll work with the arms. So again, we'll come down and enable our secondary layer and our opacity texture. This time I'm going to use this arm tattoo. So if I drop the opacity into there, you can see immediately we're getting a tattoo result. This particular tattoo does come with a color map, so rather than using a solid color like we did before, we can instead say use secondary color texture, drop our color texture into there. You can see now we're getting a colored tattoo for the arms. You can play around with the opacity adjustments if you wanted to, I don't know, for example, make it look like an old faded tattoo, for example. But I think I prefer it how it was. This particular tattoo doesn't have a normal map. Usually they don't. Tattoos, they usually obviously just below the skin layer, so they pick up the normal maps and everything of the underlying skin. If we look at our buffer visualizations again for our tattoo, you can see that it's just taking the skin, specular and roughness and normal maps, which is probably what you want for a tattoo as opposed to the thick layer of paint on the face. We'll go back to our full lit mode. Let's just take a look at how she's now looking under different lighting scenarios. So if we come to our moonlight stage, you can see her with our secondary layer applied. Let's have a look at our downtown night as well. It's looking pretty good. Come back to our main stage. And we'll have a look at one more example. So if we go back to our head material, going to clear our normal map. We'll have a look at this one here. So if we start with our opacity texture, we'll replace that. Undo our contrast changes. So we now have this different motif. This particular one doesn't come with a normal map, so we'll undo normal map. We can again change the color to whatever we like. However, this particular one does come with a color texture, so let's enable our color texture, drop it in there. You now see this makeup style secondary layer. And again, we can tweak things like the roughness and specular of this secondary layer, like I showed before. So that's basically all there is to the secondary layers. There is a metallic category as well. I don't have an example on hand, but basically you can enable it and pass again, grayscale texture into it. And where the values are white, you'll see metallic effect. Where they're black, you won't. So you can do things like if you've got makeup with metallic flakes in it, for example, you can replicate that sort of look using the metallic category as well. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope you found that useful, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.